Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty wild dynamic revealed in some recent data. We're looking at the stark contrast between those high-level global macroeconomic projections and the everyday, on-the-ground reality of worker well-being. We're going to examine global economic trends, specifically focusing on growth projections side by side with time-off benefits across developed nations. Really, we want to see exactly how these massive policy choices trickle down to you and me. And that brings us right to our core question for this explainer. Think about this for a second. Why does a supposedly booming, resilient global economy still leave so many workers feeling fundamentally left behind? To really understand this, we have to look at both the 30,000-foot view of global policy and the ground-level view of actual legal worker entitlements. Section 1, a fragile economic forecast. Okay, let's start with that 30,000-foot view and dive into the latest OECD forecast. 3.2%. That is the OECD's projection for global GDP growth in 2025. Now, on the surface, this represents a pretty resilient economy. It's actually slightly brighter than previously expected, mostly buffered by things like a huge wave of AI-related investment and improved financial conditions. But, and this is a massive but, you guys, it is still well below the 2013 to 2019 average of 3.4%. So the growth is there, for sure, but the OECD warns that it's a resilient but fragile growth. It's really fraught with financial stability risks and a whole lot of geopolitical uncertainty. When we map out the next couple of years, you can clearly see this projected dip in global GDP growth heading into 2026. It drops down to 2.9% as the impacts of higher trade tariffs start to spread. But if you look over at G20 headline inflation, we're seeing a steady, gradual cooling down, eventually hitting 2.5% by 2027. So the overall macroeconomic story here is one of stabilizing prices but slowing growth. And it's exactly this slowing growth that is sparking a massive global policy debate about labor market deregulation. Section 2, the deregulation debate. Because economic growth is cooling off, major institutions and labor advocates fundamentally disagree on the absolute best way to steer the global economy back to health. It creates a really clear philosophical clash. On one side, you have the OECD. They're recommending tightening fiscal discipline to manage public debt, along with a really strong push for labor market deregulation. Their argument is that simplifying regulations makes labor markets more flexible, which helps businesses innovate. But on the exact opposite side, you've got the Trade Union Advisory Committee, or TUAC. They argue that tightening budgets and stripping away worker protections actually harms the economy in the long run. Instead, they're calling for well-targeted public investment and stronger worker protections to stimulate demand from the bottom up. Now, we aren't here to pick a side today, right? We just want to understand how these opposing philosophies impact the real world. So let's look closely at this warning from TUAC. They argue strongly against the idea that making it easier to hire and fire workers just magically unlocks innovation. In fact, they point out that the current AI investment boom in the US, well, that's being driven by massive public investment and intense global competition, not just a lack of employment protection laws. TUAC warns that deregulating labor markets actually suppresses wages, reduces worker bargaining power, and fundamentally flatlines the consumer demand that is absolutely crucial for long-term growth. And to make things even more complicated, we have to look at where government money is actually going right now during this debate over fiscal discipline. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, global military expenditure is sitting at historic highs. To fund this, countries are having to make some incredibly tough choices. For example, the UK plans to actually cut overseas development assistance from 0.5% down to 0.3% of gross national income just to divert funds to the military. Over in France, they're issuing debt to support their arms industry. Relying on borrowing to fund these increases can drive up inflation, and redirecting funds away from social protections, well, that can really worsen economic and societal inequality. Section 3, the wealth inequality gap. What actually happens to everyday workers when economic systems prioritize high flexibility and deregulation over rigid protections? Well, let's use the United States as our primary case study to examine the micro-reality of wealth inequality. 48.9%. That is the United States Gini coefficient for the year 2020. If you're not familiar, a Gini coefficient simply measures income inequality. Basically, the higher the number, the wider the gap between the richest and poorest citizens. 48.9% is the highest Gini index score among all G7 nations, and it's the highest for the US in at least 50 years. The really crucial point here is that we need to ground abstract academic terms like labor market flexibilization into real human statistics. In the U.S. economy right now, the top 1% of earners make roughly 40 times more than the bottom 90%. We are literally looking at about 33 million US workers earning less than $10 per hour. For a family of four, that places them below the poverty line. It really shows us that while a highly deregulated labor market might create booming corporation valuations, it can also leave a massive segment of the workforce incredibly vulnerable.
Section 4. The No Vacation Nation.
Now let's pivot to arguably the most visceral, relatable, and human example of labor standards across the globe: the right to take a break. Before we look at the data, we need to define statutory leave. This is the legal minimum amount of paid time off a government forces an employer to provide to their workers. It is not a perk. It is a legally mandated entitlement. And the numbers here are wild. Data from the European Trade Union Institute, analyzing 21 rich countries, reveals a really stark divide. The dark blue bars represent legally mandated paid annual leave, while the light blue represent mandated paid public holidays. So the European Union sets a strict floor. Every member country must guarantee at least 20 days of paid leave. If you look to the far left of the dataset, France mandates 30 days. Now, scan all the way to the right. The United States sits entirely alone at absolutely zero. Let's break that down as clearly as possible. France gives 30 days by law. The United Kingdom requires 20 days. Even Japan, a country completely famous worldwide for its intense working culture, legally mandates at least 10 days of paid vacation. The United States is the only advanced economy in the world that does not guarantee its workers a single day of paid leave by law. Nothing for paid vacation, and not even for public holidays. Section 5. The time off divide. So, what actually happens domestically when the government sets the statutory minimum for rest at zero? Well, it means time off becomes a negotiated benefit rather than a basic right. Because this is left entirely up to individual employers, the lack of government mandates results in severe inequality when it comes to worker well-being. About 1 in 4 U.S. workers, that's 25% of the private sector workforce, receives absolutely zero paid vacation or paid public holidays. None. And for the folks who do get it, it is heavily tied to how much you make. Lower-wage workers earning under $15 an hour average just 10 days of leave, while higher-wage workers average 14. And if you work part-time, only 36% of part-time workers get any paid leave at all. When economic policy prioritizes maximum business dynamics over mandated standards, the ability to simply rest becomes a luxury tied directly to your wage bracket. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today and leaves us with this final thought. When organizations like the OECD project 3.2% global growth and push for deregulation to achieve it across OECD member countries, we really have to ask ourselves, who is that growth really for? If a nation boasts incredible productivity in hyper-flexible markets, but a quarter of its workforce doesn't have a single paid day off to rest, see their families, or just recover, does that resilient economic growth actually matter? It's really a question of what we value more, the macro statistics on a spreadsheet or the micro well-being of the actual people driving the economy. Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer, and keep questioning the data.